Gentlemen, our guest today is Richard Deitchman. He is a retired naval commander, flew during World War II off of Manila Bay during the Gulf of Leyte, or the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He's one of three brothers who were all naval aviators. His story today, which is through back in '08, he did a Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and his daughter Amy and grandson Joe are going to tell his story. Amy is going to narrate a little history, and Joe gets to play his grandfather. And before we start, a special thanks. Claire, please stand up. This is a daughter. We've got 5 of the 9 siblings here today, but Claire put this all together for us, and she deserves a round of applause. So, without further ado, Amy and Joe, you're on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us here today. Naval Commander Richard Deitchman is a member of the greatest generation. His story is like that of many young people of his era. Though there are fewer of them alive today, we are fortunate that Richard Deitchman can be here to hear his story shared with you and to answer your questions. I'm one of Richard's 9 children. My name is Amy. I will give you some background information, and Richard's grandson, Joe Deitchman, who is also a U.S. Army veteran, 101st Airborne Division, will add some of our dad's actual words as he shared in an interview conducted by my brother-in-law, John Wolf, who himself served in the Navy. His interview of Richard Deitchman was for the Veterans History Project that is now archived at the Library of Congress. Before you hear Richard's story, there are 2 things you should know. Two things you should know. First, his father, Carl Deitchman, was an immigrant to the United States from Austria. He arrived in 1912. Richard is the 4th child of 7 born to Carl and his wife, Teresa. They raised their family in Kansas City, Kansas. This is a picture of our dad, Richard, with his father, Carl. The second thing that is relevant to Richard's pre-war story is that his father, Carl, was fascinated with flying.
When I was 9 or 10 years old, my dad bought me a ride on a Ford Tri-Motor. It was 50 cents a ride, and he took my brother and me up for a ride. It was a big thrill. Also, I used to walk down to the airport and watch the planes fly. So aviation was always something in our family for some crazy reason.
The family interest in flying continued as Richard's 2 older brothers, Bill and Vince, enlisted in the Navy and were both pilots. In terms of Richard's military story, there are 3 basic parts: enlisting and training, war action, and post-war service. So let's get started with the enlisting and training. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the U.S. government allowed high school graduates to become naval aviators, rather than requiring 2 years of college. Richard was a freshman in junior college and enlisted in the U.S. Navy in May of 1942. When his father took him to the train station, he was sending his 3rd son off to war, and he was quite emotional. His father didn't know it then, but all 3 sons would return safely from the war. One memorable and entertaining thing happened during Richard's physical.
In my case, I was kind of muscular, and on my application, they wrote muscular development to the heavy frame, not disqualifying. It's interesting how that little comment had a future effect. One of my closest friends was reading my medical report and said, "What's this? Muscular development? Heavy frame?" From that point on, they called me the Frame. That lasted the entire time I was at Richard.
There was extensive training in numerous locations that was part of preparing naval aviators for war. Early on, what was called E-Base, or Elimination Base, in Livermore, California. Richard became good friends with Ray Crandall, a fellow aviator who Richard would know throughout the war and well beyond. In fact, it was Ray who came up with the nickname, The Frame. Ray was a friend for life who was like a brother. They were both competitive and hardworking, with Ray bringing out the fun-loving side of Richard. Throughout the training time, there was lighthearted fun and there was tragedy. While at E-Base, Richard was on a practice flight with an instructor.
My instructor and I were following another plane, which was doing the same maneuver. Their plane had spun into an adjacent field and it crashed. My instructor had taken over and was able to land our plane in the same field. We went to help the other instructor and student out of the crash, but the instructor was killed and the student fatally injured. An emergency crew, which was at the practice field, arrived and took over. We flew back to our main base and I walked up the flight line. I was already scheduled for my B stage check flight with another instructor. Shortly thereafter, I was on the same field. I was making S-turns to the circle. This instructor was telling me about the dangers of getting slow in a turn, not knowing that I was at the accident scene. Incidentally, I passed my check flight.
At one of their training stops in Fort Lauderdale, Richard and his good friend Ray started flying TBMs, torpedo bombers. They had a wonderful teacher who had been in a torpedo squadron overseas. One exercise involved what they called a tail chase, which meant the pilots would try to stay with him as he would dive and maneuver around. Richard felt this particular instructor really taught him how to fly a torpedo bomber confidently. Finally, after passing numerous checks, the pilots were sent to the Great Lakes Naval Air Station near Chicago to fly off the USS Sable in Lake Michigan. That is where they were carrier qualified. One other thing happened there. They were given a swim test. They had to jump off a high platform into a pool and swim a mile. Richard and Ray had no problem doing this, but the swim test was a challenge for some of the pilots. This will come up again, so remember that. Richard got his wings in August of 1943, about 16 months after he had enlisted. He was 19 years old. He and Ray were sent to Seattle to join a squadron. Richard's older brother, Bill, was the exec of the fighter pilots in the same squadron. Their training continued in several different locations, finishing in North Island, the big naval base in San Diego.
Well, there was no room on the main base, so they put us up at the Del Coronado Hotel. What an awful thing. We used to laugh. We said, we'll stay home every night. We were there about a month. It was a really neat deal. Just one of those lucky things.
And now on to war action. In July of 1944, Richard's squadron was shipped overseas to Hawaii, where they finally went aboard the aircraft carrier USS Manila Bay. Once on board, they learned their first mission would be to support the landing of troops at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines.
We took the troop ships up there and landed on August 20th, 1944. My crew and I were above the landing when General MacArthur walked on the beaches at Leyte. After that, on August 25th, was the Battle of Leyte Gulf.
During this action, Richard successfully torpedoed a Japanese Tone-class cruiser named the Chikuma. This would later earn him a Silver Star. However, after a few other events and being separated from his ship, Richard landed on the USS Bella Wood. Shortly after landing, the ship was hit by a kamikaze, and Richard's radio man was killed. In total, about 140 people were killed by the kamikaze hit.
In the torpedo squadron, you know that the relationship was about working together. It was really hard when I lost Joe Pusateri on the Bella Wood. In fact, when I was in Chicago later on, I stopped at his home to see his parents, even though I had already written them a letter when it had happened.
Eventually, Richard was reunited with his squadron on the USS Manila Bay, and their next mission was to help land the troops at Mindoro. And I would just mention that this picture is Richard and his two brothers.
Then, while we were escorting the troops, our ship, the Manila Bay, got hit by a kamikaze. It killed about 15 guys and went right into our combat air control center, which had our radar and everything. It caused a big hump in our flight deck.
We are now to January 17th, 1945. This was to be Richard's final flight during World War II, though he didn't know it at the time. It was a pre-dawn flight with 4 torpedo bombers targeting a mountainous area of the Philippines. However, tragedy struck on the flight deck when the pilot from the first plane had engine trouble and stepped out of his plane and into the propeller of the second plane. Richard, being the third plane, was immediately sent out as the leader of what was to be a 2-plane rather than 4-plane mission. After hitting their targets and heading back to the ship, trouble began.
All of a sudden, one of my crewmen said, "You were smoking." They had just made a landing strip at Lingayen, one of the Marsan matting fields. We were able to fly back there and land.
After checking out the plane, Richard and his crew cranked it back up and decided to head to their ship, which was about 50 miles away.
We were about 10 miles away from our ship. We got to see our ships. All of a sudden, the engine quits. Cold. I'm about 2,000 feet. So immediately I think, uh-oh. And I try to restart the engine, go through my regular procedures, eventually kick on the emergency IFF, which tells the ships that we are in trouble, and I tell them we are going in. And so I make a water landing.
After all the training for such an emergency, everyone knows what to do. A raft is inflated, and Richard finds out that his radio man has a broken leg, but is also panicky because he doesn't know how to swim.
Remember that swimming test I had told you about in Glenview, Illinois? This guy got someone to swim for him. So here he is. I think he's in shock. Really? All of a sudden, my gunner and I, we were in the raft. I grabbed the tail of the plane, and I'm holding on, and I said, "Book." His name is Booker. "You better get in there and get this guy." So he hops in the water and pulls him over and gets him on the raft, but with none of the extra gear. So I helped him pull him in. By that time, we had drifted away. Our plane is going down.
This was the South China Sea, and the conditions were very rough. Even though the distance was about 10 miles, it took about 2.5 hours for the raft to be rescued. They were spotted by a fighter jet that was looking for them. A destroyer picked them up and then took them back to the carrier.
There's a Navy tradition. When a pilot is returned to a ship, that ship would give the returning ship ice cream. They flew a breeches buoy over. It's like a big donut, and you would sit in it, and they'd pull you from one side to another with a rope. They took my gunner over first. He was smaller. And then I went over, and I just about got dipped. And they decided not to take over the radio man because of his broken leg. So he stayed on the destroyer, and they took him to an island, and then took him off. Anyway, that was an interesting time. After that, we headed back to San Diego.
However, had the USS Manila Bay not been damaged by a kamikaze hit, it would have gone on to Iwo Jima. But instead it returned to San Diego in February of 1945. Within days of getting off the ship, Richard would be the best man for his older brother Bill. Bill had met Dorothy during their stay at the Del Coronado Hotel, and they had kept up a steady correspondence while Bill was overseas. From that beginning in 1945, they had a long, happy marriage and raised 7 children. However, At that point, the war was still on, and Richard and his friend Ray decided they wanted to be fighter pilots. The Navy agreed, but said they would have to be night fighter pilots. And by the way, this is Richard and Ray. It was during this training period, which took place in several locations, that the war officially ended. They were discharged in December of 1945. And here's the final part, Richard's post-war service. After about a month home, Richard returned to the Navy in Patuxent River, Maryland, where he was a test pilot. He spent 2 years there, flying all kinds of airplanes, and viewed it as a great experience. After serving as a test pilot, he went back to college at Rutgers College in Kansas City. He continued to fly in the reserves. He earned a master's degree at St. Louis University. When the Korean War started, life had changed quite a bit for Richard. He was married and had 3 kids. Side note, their family would grow to 9 kids. So rather than be deployed, Richard was able to serve as a naval aviation cadet recruiter.
I visited colleges and universities in Kansas and the western half of Missouri. There was about 100 schools. I would go there and talk to the students and recruit them. And they would come and we would run tests. I would give them physicals at Olathe Air Base, and they would go on to flight school. We did well.
Richard began his business career with Montgomery Ward and continued to serve in the Navy Reserve. He retired in 1962 as a commander. He had spent 20 years in the Navy, from May of 1942 to May of 1962. He received the Silver Star for disabling a Japanese heavy cruiser during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Navy Commendation Medal, Philippine Liberation Ribbon, World War II Victory Medal, Air Medals, and most recently in 2022, a Scroll of Honor from the Navy League of the United States in testimony and tribute to his outstanding service. Richard continued his love of flying and began soaring in 1970. This became a serious pastime that brought him great pleasure and allowed him to take members of his family up in the air with him, while also offering him the escape he needed for some peace and quiet, and to keep everything in perspective. He retired from flying with 4,082 flying hours and had flown 34 different planes. But the most hours was the TBM torpedo plane at 621.8 hours. He also passed on his love of flying to 2 of his sons, Jim and George, both skilled and active pilots today. Finally, reflecting on his war experience, Richard was asked if he was ever afraid, and he responded,
I don't think we were afraid. We were young.
That's the end.
Richard, you need to stand up. We've got to,
Questions for Richard?
Let him sit on that stool.
Richard, you want to sit right here? Is it working?
The green light is on. There you go. Is it out of range?
This is not working. Hello, hello. Better?
Okay. Questions?
Any questions?
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Deitchman? Yes, sir.
Sir, did you ever have to bring a torpedo back to the ship? When it was-
No, once you carried one and you dropped it, that was it.
Well, I know. If it won't release from the aircraft, you're faced with bringing it back to the carrier.
No, we had one plane that a fellow, it got hung up.
Yeah.
And it was just hanging there, and he finally was able to shake it off. But they wouldn't let you bring it back. No, but it did happen all the time.
At what airspeed were you when you released the torpedo?
That's interesting, because initially, when we first started flying for torpedoes, we started off at 1,000 feet. And then, as the time went on, we were able to get better equipment. So at the time when I dropped my torpedo, I could go as fast as I could go. And I dropped it at, I guess, about 1,000 feet. And instead of being, so we didn't have to get real close to the ships that we're trying to drop at. Initially, when we were training, we were having to go real close, and we had to actually go over the ship. And that would been brutal. So things, it kept getting better as the war progressed.
Question about that.
Okay.
Did you have any trouble with the torpedo not working?
You have any trouble with the torpedo not working?
No, I only dropped about 3 or 4 torpedoes. 3, 4 practice, and then only the one real one for dropping against the target.
Sir, was your plane hit with anti-aircraft fire on that run?
Well, I was lucky, but once I dropped the torpedo, I broke away, and my radio man and my were able to see the flight, see the carrier, see the plane where I dropped the torpedo, and it hit it, and they said, you hit it, because I was trying to get out of there.
This is also back before you could communicate via radio. You guys would do a lot of hand signals, and you read off of your lead plane, he tilted to the left, and then you thought.
Well, yeah, we communicated mostly by hand. We didn't talk a lot among ourselves.
It was mentioned in the presentation about if you brought a shipmate back to the ship, you got some ice cream. Is that really
The
true?
ice cream. Who wants to?
Oh, yeah, ice cream. Well, that if they brought you back, we were supposed to give the ship, the little destroyer, some ice cream. So that was supposed to be.
They had actually taken buoys and stuffed them full of the cream and everything, since it was so hot out in the Philippines, and they had somebody put on a bunch of winter gear and fly up in elevation to freeze.
This was some Marines. I got separated from the ship, and we ended up with this Marine base, and I couldn't understand why this guy was all dressed up with his flight gear, and then we finally found out they had a big box underneath each wing, and that was the ice cream. So they were taking it up and freezing.
And that was at the Lingayen
That, I forget.
a couple years ago.
Yes.
Commander, thanks for your service, sir.
Thank you.
2 questions for you. Since you retired in 1962, have you had, I'll just give you both questions and you can go wherever you want with them. Since you retired in 1962, have you been interacting with what we might call today's generation of naval aviators? And have you had any visits to carriers or been down to Pensacola? Whatever, that's the first question. Second question, what would you tell today's high school students about joining the service like you did?
Well, I'll do the first one first. But I have been on a cruise with what they call the Tiger Cruise, and went back because some friends that had my son Jim over here. He has a buddy that, and they decided to go to Hawaii. So we all went out to Hawaii and then came back. So that was a Tiger cruise. And then as far as would I ask, yeah, I would tell any kid if he really wants to fly, it's a great opportunity to go into the Navy or Air Force or whatever. You gotta wanna, you know.
Very good, thank you.
He had recently been honored during a speech on the Memorial Day at the Gold Star event downtown at the Indiana thing. Recently retired 3-star General Jansen had always looked up to my grandfather, and he had given him a nice set of words, and he had actually invited him on the Tiger cruise.
Yeah.
So for us, our family being invited to that was a good honor, and it's good to have family friends, especially, you know, we all are different, but we're all the same, and it's a beautiful thing to have that camaraderie continue even after, long after. No offense.
Yeah.
Can you briefly tell us what all you did while you were a Navy reservist after the war?
Well, as a reservist, we flew, we had 2 days a month that we spent with the squadrons. And I went with different squadrons and flew different kinds of airplanes. Finally, we first started flying jets, so that was kind of nice. So kept that up until I got my 20 years in.
He did a lot of test work, and so he was there when they first brought the slide over, and he had actually cut his head open he tried to take off, and the plane had crashed immediately, and he had cut your head on the roof.
But that it didn't have a turnover. Okay. Anyway.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Well, we certainly want to thank you, both of you, for being a narrator, and so we're giving you one of our mugs, 100-year anniversary mugs, and one for you, Richard. And for Richard, also, we'd like to give you one of our Service Club books that gives kind of the history of the club, and then also one of our challenge coins.
Thank you so much.
And we thank you very much for your service and for your service.
I'm glad we didn't wait that long.
How many of you have been on an honor flight?
Yeah.
Apparently, I mean, there's a flight coming in this Saturday from